yesterday we had an incredible nerd out session, right? Incredible nerd out session. Just lots of ponderance, or is it ponderance? I don't know. Ponderance. Lots of wondering about Japanese, the relationship between Japanese and English culture reflected in their language, right? Talked about English flexibility versus Japanese precision. So baseline precision was comparing contrast between the baseline precision. So this is loose, right? Strict, and how that affects the learning process between an English speaker learning Japanese and a Japanese speaker learning English. But since I'm not a Japanese person, the ponderance is here. Like if Japanese people, the reverse. I was trying to do a role reversal, because one thing that I really enjoy when having experiences, personal experiences, I often like to think vicariously through. I like to challenge myself to vicariously experience things through the lens of other people or other conditions. That really enhances someone who cares to teach, right? Because often the teaching efficacy, the efficacy of teaching, really is strongly associated with the ability to vicariously or place yourself in the person's shoes that you're teaching. As much as you're an expert, if you consider yourself an expert, which I feel like as a teacher, it's not the aim to be an expert, but the aim to be efficacious. Because you can spout out all your years of experience with no efficacy, right? That's kind of the thing. And we talked a lot about English too. We nerded out a lot about English because English is my primary language, and there was a lot of fun things. Like I realized now that I'm learning a new language, right, formally again. Back in the day when I was learning Spanish, there was a formal structure. So someone was providing like metrics, right? Metrics, evaluation and stuff. I was a college kid, high school to college. So teaching, as much as I would say I tutored and all that stuff, it was nowhere in the scope of enough perspective to understand all the effort that it takes and all the other different skills involved in becoming a formal educator, right? So when I was learning Spanish, all of this stuff was provided to me. But now, our discussion yesterday, the one fun discussion that took me all evening to like dive a little into is that I haven't really strongly even evaluated my own English proficiency. And it took a dialogue with another person to really start thinking about, I have no idea. I legitimately have no idea what my English proficiency is. And oftentimes when I think of language and communication, since it's a life skill, much like communication, learning and communication, those things, it just doesn't ever feel like I need evaluation per se, because I'm always working on these things. They're life skills to me. So every day, every living, breathing moment that I'm conscious, I'm thinking about these processes. I don't stop learning to learn and using communication. So then the time came and I said something that reminded me of how little I am paying attention to how others evaluate proficiency. So how others evaluate language proficiency. And that's kind of insensitive of me, honestly, because these language proficiency evaluations are generally the metrics that younger people would use, since they don't have a form of basis yet, like a form of relative. Like, for example, my Japanese proficiency is going to be referenced to my English proficiency, like how I feel, my experiences with English, all the notes and intuitiveness. However, if you're younger and you're still trying to develop your relatives, I mean, by 18, your primary language will be a great standardization for how you feel about a new language, for certain. Generally, that gap makes it really hard to take up a new language because the gap is that much higher with every passing year. Your primary language, without a secondary language, your primary language excels higher and higher, right, from regular use, and that comfort zone makes a wider and wider gap. So how big is my gap? Well, yeah, this is where after some like 4 or 5 hours of evening digging, I'm gonna definitely say that I am a victim of imposter syndrome, which that kind of happens all the time. I usually try very hard not to let this take hold in a professional setting, because oftentimes what happens is you project yourself as falling short, right? Project yourself as falling short all the time, and this can backfire. When you project yourself falling short, oftentimes this is an art form, right? If you're a little bit off, it demonstrates humility, right? Oftentimes a little off, like, oh, you know, I still got a lot to work. It keeps you grounded. There's a lot of things I don't know. That's fair, right? But when you're hecka off, like when you're just hecka like off into oblivion, as in you undersell yourself, that can backfire in a professional setting. That could leave you looking amateurish, or you're misrepresenting, and that can make your audience feel distrusting of you, and also perhaps ulterior motives that tend to be in a negative sense, right? What usually that means is a hustle. There's hustling involved. So a lot of times it's an art form. Little off, being humble, is very professional. Hecka off shows incompetence. So in this case, I was incredibly incompetent, and that might also feed back to my imposter syndrome that I keep at bay. I generally like to underestimate myself most of the time. So in this case, reality kind of struck, right? Someone made a comment. We were talking about English vocabulary bank. Like, how does one measure English vocabulary? Because the JLPT has this, like, one of the bullet points that come up all the time is vocabulary, or not necessarily vocabulary per se, but it's more like kanji. Like, there's a hyper focus on kanji. I don't think personally that's the component that makes Japanese proficiency difficult for English speakers, but hyper focus on kanji because there's a very measurable volume, right? So passingly, I threw out a number. I'm like, I feel like I have 10k English words, right? 10k English words. And I realized I have no idea what that means. Like, I just chose 10k. I feel like I can name 10,000 words. Like, if I had to do a 24-hour stream and try to write down 10k words, I can probably hit 10k. and I have no idea how they did it. So someone suggested it's about frequency. So they used a weighted average in order to get a general idea of what that is. And turns out when it comes to like the English, whatever it's called, the English proficiency stuff, this 10K is like barely native, apparently. Like it's barely native. As in someone who uses English as a primary language would rank around 10K. And I was thinking, what the heck? Am I really off the mark? So, you know, you have lots of free things, guidance around, and this friend, Turnus, or this person that I met recently, who's quite enthusiastic about language, probably even more enthusiastic than myself, said maybe I give them the impression that it's between 50 and 60K. Well, it turns out because of, like, I guess educational background, speech patterns, right, stuff like that, and there was a raising of scientific writing, and I noticed something incredibly weird or suspicious in a way that I'm not sure if this is great. So long story short, first, turns out reality was pretty generous. So it turns out I'm in between here. Obviously, it's between 10K and 50 and 60. And I just messing around and taking like random free things and all that stuff. I landed around 50K actually. So 40 to 50K, presumably. Now, here's the weird thing. I wanted to go into the methodology of the ideas behind these like free examinations and stuff. Some of them had methodology listed, and then a lot of times the keyword that comes up is like frequency. Oh, you know what? We're definitely going to this digression now, huh? Isn't it? This is gonna be our digression for the day. So, a lot. I understand the whole frequency. You know, a word's rarity, right? When it comes to languages, as much as I love learning new words, right? Learning new words. Oftentimes, I think there's a duality here when it comes to the English language. So, as most things, when it comes to quantity and quality, right? If we're talking about the psychological attraction to certain things, like how much of something versus how good those things are. Like, I know there's individual variability. What we can say is there is such thing as too much quantity and too much quality, as in too much hyper focus on these things. So there's going to be an upper limit for the comfort, like an upper limit for the comfort and number of these things. And there's a duality about English here, where I do feel like one of the elements of English has crossed the quantity line well before already. And that's no short in contributed to the quote universal use of this language. It's not a contest. It's just whatever became convenient at first, coincidentally, with all our like facets and stuff. There are ways to make this attraction, the attractiveness of English, appealing after the fact. Like post facto, there are many coincidences that would lead one to make a persuasive argument that English became universally used for a lot of reasons that are very powerful, like enough coincidences. However, that's after the fact. Let's just say English for its status, it's conventionally now universally used for whatever reason. Whether it's better, harder, easier, it's just universally used now, right? So because of this universal use, there's a consequence to that. And that's the incredibly high rate of creating new English words. Like, it just keeps happening. So even if English's total word bank, say if the total word bank is nowhere near some other language, for example, I can think of a few actually. The thing is, those languages are either going at a slower rate of creation. It's likely to go at a slower rate of creation due to its lack of universal use compared to English. So while English may not necessarily have the biggest total word bank, although it does actually, like of the many most spoken, it's actually among the top. But that's not what I'm talking about here. It's more like over time, there are really, really old words, and there are really, really new words every day. And what I mean by old and new words per se, like, because it's staggered, words take a while to officially be entered into the English language, etc., like the whole official thing, but there's constant turnover in English. So while the rate is high, right, the rate is high for creation, you may also argue that over time it reached possibly closer to a steady state rate of old words turning over, and there might be a higher upper limit to old words turning over, because at some point those the synonyms, antonyms, they might fade. I mean, synonyms might fade a bit, but there is this cycling potential to come back as a new word. So what we can say probably very safely is that due to the universal use, there's probably too much quantity at a very fast rate. And what happens when you accelerate quantity is it kind of is an inverse to quality. So words become superfluous, right? They become a little bit excessive, or even redundant for that matter. Thing like same could be redundant, right? But ironically, redundant doesn't have the same connotations as same. And same is nondescript or less descript than redundant, and so on and so forth. And you can imagine, where am I going with this? Well, we're trying to measure English proficiency, right? And a lot of times other languages, their rate of word creation, and their standardization of vocabulary goes hand in hand. As in, when we think about the Japanese language, JLPT, right? The Japanese language proficiency. There's always like some standard metric number, some like volume to evaluate as a component of a speaker's proficiency. And I start thinking, well, okay, that's well and good. You're evaluating English based on frequency, because if one were to try to remember the English word bank, I couldn't come up with the answer. These will take way too long to research and stuff. It's like, how static is this word bank? Like, how long does it take for the English word bank to change in number? as a person who thought about being in formal education, it takes a really long time to reevaluate standards. So like when you're doing a English proficiency test, I actually think it's kind of hard to standardize anything if the word bank doesn't stay the same for a prolonged time. It becomes very inefficient because you would have to redo the tests. I'm sure maybe technology will help in the future where you can automate the process of updating the standardization and weightedness of English proficiency based on the frequency of words. But it was really fun. It was fun to look at word frequency for English. Word frequency for English. And here's where it gets a little bit weird. I'm not going to talk about Japanese anymore, or like for the time being, I'm not going to relate it back to Japanese because all these questions are so interesting in Japanese too. But I do not know enough Japanese to really get the sense of the inappropriateness, in my opinion, the inappropriateness of thinking that English proficiency can be evaluated similarly to Japanese proficiency. It's inappropriate. I'm not saying it's wrong or right. It just strikes me as I have a lot of questions. And the reason why I want to point out this apples to orange thing is only just to give some confidence to people who feel compelled to make this apple and oranges comparison that may mislead oneself to inappropriately weigh one over the other. So what I mean by that is, as a person that is always questioning how comparable methodology is, I'm a process-oriented person. I love methodology, but this stuff takes a lot of time, lots of time. Honestly, otherwise we would be pumping out scientific PhDs all the time, right? So methodology. The reason is I start thinking when people think, oh yeah, I know English, but it takes me so long to learn 60 kanji. And then they would do like some logical rationale for, well, 60 of the 1,000 I need to get to N1 versus the English. Excuse me. I think English, I'm going to say it was like anywhere from 15K to 20K. I think the number was like 16K was the official for whatever C2 is, like compared to like the top of N1, right? And then there's, C2 plus, N1 plus, which is just not measured. It's just whatever's after. It's kind of like becoming a quote-unquote Dan in martial arts, right? And that's just the beginning of the journey after, right? This is where scaling no longer happens. This is specialist territory. And this is what I want to focus on, this whole specialist territory. So oftentimes when you become a native speaker, which is what people strive to when they learn new languages, they want to be native-like is the phrase, I suppose. Native-like speaker. Well, see, this is when you stop becoming a generalist. You're no longer a generalist. No longer. This is when you enter specialization. And this is the problem that I have with not so much Japanese because I don't understand enough, because I am clearly not a Japanese specialist, and I probably won't strive to be one. So it won't be one. This is my intent in all purposes. I will like the rest of the specialization. I like the world I like people who are specialists to inspire me. So I love to leave things there. So I like to be proficient generally. I guess the word would be proficient at something, and meet people who are specialists, people who dedicated more time than I would to be experts and masters, and they educate me because I'm proficient enough to understand. So I'm probably never going to be a specialist in Japanese. So that also means that I will probably unlikely to be native-like speaker, and that's perfectly all right. I'm incredibly satisfied when I can understand and try to appreciate as much as I can to the art of native-like speakers, right? Or native speakers. So while I can't understand Japanese, coincidentally, because of life skills, right? Life skills requires a primary language for communication. So that's one of my obligatory special skills, which is English. I would consider myself a specialist in English due to my educational background and my specialties, right? Science technically does require a specialization in English. But hear me out here. It's not the same as the topic that we raised yesterday, which is the idea of precision. While so far in my very nascent early phases of the Japanese language learning, one theme that inherently comes up is the theme of precision. And I absolutely love it. Like, I love Japanese language on precision. In fact, I'm kind of, as full disclosure, I'm kind of addicted to the nerd culture, I would call it. And I'm using this as a euphemism. Nerd, like the reverse, I don't know, this is going to be weird. I'm the reverse otaku of Japanese speakers. Hey Jojo. So I'm addicted to the reverse otaku of Japanese speakers. So those people who are native-like Japanese speakers or native speakers explaining the intricacies of their language and just fully demonstrating how such a strong emphasis on precision for the Japanese language. Now, to contrast this, I absolutely love this because it's a breath of fresh air. Because as what I would humbly consider myself as an English specialist, the charm of English is in precision. And what I mean by that is it's not about maximizing. A lot of times the joy of English is not necessarily maximizing its precision or even its weight. For example, like you could say a kanji is far heavier. Like, kanji is far heavier. It's deliberately trying to be as heavy as possible. So the Japanese language is trying to condense itself, compress, and make their meanings go further. So the precision goes up. As in, if I say this word, there's so much in it that it's encompassing all the meaning. Meanwhile, I would say as an English specialist, And the only reason I'm calling myself comfortably a specialist is because English, when you become a specialist, it's compartmentalized. What do I mean by compartmentalized? And this is where I have problems with evaluating English proficiency. If it's based on word bank, a lot of times this is a common metric because it's convenient, it's practical. Methodology is fairly sound for the ones that I've noticed, like how they weighted, the frequency, the rarity of the words, the recurrence of the words and whatnot. But English specialization, right? If you're really at the, once you're past native like, fair enough, you're past native like, the range after C2 plus is gigantic if you're using word frequency. In Japan, in Japanese, it's smaller after N1. So oftentimes this could be perceived as easier to measure, perhaps. But the word I want to say is it's probably a little bit more accurate, right? Because the proportionality is maintained in a smaller range. This variance is gigantic. And this is where the whole compartmentalize comes in. So I was testing, what's a rare word? What's a rare word in English? Because a lot of times that's what they're doing. They're weighing frequencies. So the rarer the word, the rarer, as in used, written, etc. They try to compile this amount of database. I often found out the most common words in specialized areas are among the rarest. And let me tell you about specialized area. Being old is a specialized area in English. So if you use like phrases like wishy-washy, lollygagging, you know, just words that classify you as old. That is actually a compartmentalized specialist. So it becomes rare when you get old because English has a turnover. So that's one of the fun ones. You started learning Korean because I was in a silly, goofy mood. Awesome, Jojo. Keep on learning. Keep on learning. I'm not sure if I'm gonna get to learning Korean, but I do have a lot of ear training hearing Korean media. So here's another one. And this is my personal contribution. Science. And you can go even further. Biology. And then you can go further. Genetics. So if you're talking about the frequency of words, right? Based on how rare they are and what, the most common words in a field, so when you become a specialist in a field, are actually among some of the rarest in English proficiency. So that's kind of weird, but I can see there's a pros and cons to this. It does help capture a person who is very well educated, which is great. Does it measure English proficiency as a whole to the whole population, you know, the planet's population stuff? That's a big trade-off, right? And obviously English proficiency isn't just evaluated. English proficiency isn't just evaluated on one. You have to triangulate, right? You need to your methodology has to include all the confounding and possible pre-selection bias, right? However, in my opinion, there's a cultural difference in English that I want to encourage people to understand, especially as an English speaker myself, that when you're down, like say you're demoralized by how fast or accurate you may be with other languages, other languages, right? And then you start thinking that's how you feel, because generally when you're evaluating and you're self-teaching, not without a formal structure, so you're not going to universities where they provide the formal structure and whatnot, so you don't think about it. When you're self-teaching, you're often you're trying to discover and develop the skills to measure one's own aptitude, right? With this, though, you're going to have some intuitive interference, right? And what I mean by intuitive interference is the feelings. Like, hey, I know so much. Like, for example, a thought that I would say would come up is, man, I know so many English words. Why am I having trouble just remembering 50 kanji? That kind of thing. And the idea is hyper-focusing on the raw numbers, the objectivity of comparing apples to apples, like the word bank kind of thing. And this pattern came up quite a lot in discussion, where when people think about the difficulty of language and whatnot and the feel of their progress, well, generally speaking, I'm trying to both deflate those who are gaining pace in word bank, but at the same time raising how terrible it may feel when someone thinks, well, I know 50k English words. How bad could it be to learn 100 kanji, right? Well, to temper expectations is to try to provide a smaller range of emotional variability so that one can stay consistent in learning. So the idea is you might not do as well as you think, not as well, but you're also not going to do not as bad as you may think on your worst days. Here lies one of the reasons, in my opinion. So in English, I feel terms are actively being created in a closed circle. And my concern about the way English proficiency, or at least the weight, I'm not sure how much the weight it is, when it comes to like vocabulary, sure, it does raise the baseline of how well spoken you are in English. Absolutely. Having a very generalized word bank is fantastic. But how do you evaluate that? And oftentimes, you would correlate this with frequency, like how often the word comes up, right? How often the word comes up in writing and whatnot. That would give you an estimation of someone's relative English variability or like range in their vocabulary. When someone is incredibly well spoken, it doesn't necessarily require these closed circles, specialized terminology. It doesn't stop people from intuiting that someone who's very proficient at the English language also is super likely to have these specialized vocabulary. The dissonance here is that which is what I often talk about, charisma does require some sort of intellectual component, right? Intelligent component, or perhaps even a dexterous component. However, at the highest level, when you start to compartmentalize, it's actually quite detrimental at the highest level. It's like detrimental to charisma. And oftentimes when you think of when you think of a language proficiency, you're talking about how well you're trying to measure how well someone learns from a language and communicates with that language. And there is an upper limit, I would say, especially to English. I'm not sure if it's the same for Japanese, but in terms of English proficiency, I often like to think of it not from a metric standpoint, but if you're a native speaker, you would be able to speak to a lot of people. Well, the irony here is that when you become super specialized, you actually decrease in your proficiency to talk to other people, right? So what I mean is, here's a really weird situation where if you're super specialized, I have deficiencies. I have very well-known, the valley is not that low, but there's this dip here, right? Where when you think about rarity and frequency, there's a group of words that I don't really use that much, and I can forget them. Like, there's a chance I'll forget words where a lot of people in a non-specialized area, this area would be their most use. Actually, it's probably like a little bit more humpy like that. So they would use this group, but I would use like this, the generalized group, and then the specialized group. So words that I miss are crazy. Like I just never heard of those words or haven't even used those words before. Like, and then there are words that are really surprising, but like, see, I can't even come up with them. Oh, one word I learned yesterday. Weir. Like, weir? I didn't even know that was a word. I thought that was a name. Like, weir. So the reason why I know weir is because I know some friends who, this is a personal thing about regarding their names and stuff. But man, weir. So it's like a dam in English. Like it's describing a form of a dam. It's a man-made structure that regulates water flow, right? And this is like common. I'm just thinking to myself, man, I am way out of touch with English. But then I start thinking about words that are surprisingly common, apparently. Apparently, inoculate is common too. And when I think about the synonyms or the synonym choices, I can't even spell synonym. See, that's synonym. There's probably an O somewhere. Synonym? This is illustrating my point. So this word is common, but when I saw the choices, I did not agree. I did not agree with any of the choices. But the problem, it's not the test's problem, is that inoculate is used for a different meaning when it comes to common. It's not used this way in a specialized way. So I'm genuinely curious if the precision of Japanese holds up when you become a native-like speaker, right? Like, do Japanese people at the native-like level universally agrees, or they end up being bimodal, where like there's a group of people who are very specialized who just disagrees with common usage of these words. And it's baffling because I've been in this situation a lot when I was looking at common and rare words that would indicate someone who has a larger or smaller English word bank. So thing inoculate, for example, the context that people think about for the word inoculate is vaccination. That's it. Like, that's it. And I'm like, boy, that's not that. Like, I would say 80% of the time that I use this word, it is not for this definition. It is not for this sentiment. Vaccination is not even close to 80% of the usage of this word in my life. So does that make me an English specialist? Yes and no. Yes, because they're trying to measure rarity. Or no, sorry. Is yes because they're trying to measure. That's, I meant to say no because they're trying to measure rarity, right? And because I don't use this word like everyone else most of the time, it makes me more incompetent. I am actually more incompetent. And ironically, this is a specialized word for my specialized education. So it's so weird, and I'm curious if this happens in Japanese. I'll never really actually know because I don't aim to be a specialist in Japanese. But if I am someone who apparently ballparking, they said that I'm anywhere between 45k to 50k word knowledge, I don't even know if I use these words proficiently. It's so weird. Like, the feeling just doesn't strike me. I guess I got humbled, like, in a really reverse way. I got humbled in a really reverse way. I really thought my educational level when it comes to the English proficiency was 10k. Yesterday, I told Turnus that I feel like I know 10,000 useful words. Like, useful words. Especially when I'm talking on stream. I would say when I'm talking on stream, it's around 10k. Maybe even less. It's between 5k and 10k, right? But the thing here is, just because the language went down, obviously this is in a vacuum. I'm talking in a vacuum just with the numbers as dictation of English proficiency. There are probably a lot of other ways to determine this, and they added all this into the English proficiency test. But with this, I become a specialist in communicating on stream, right? So ultimately, I can kind of see where they're coming from, because I would use a larger range of vocabulary for different situations. Now, here's where I'm worried, because if the overlap, say situation 1, which is A, and situation B looks like this, right? So say I use 15k here and 15k here. Does this mean my proficiency is where they overlap? Because these would be the common words, as in how frequently I'll remind myself what these words mean, as in these will be hard-coded, right? And I would refer to these as the generalized words. I don't know. I would love to talk to a linguistic expert to understand. Perhaps it's more like this, where like A's and B's and the generalized pool of English words are incredibly common, so that using this method will still represent proficiency. Because oftentimes I do feel that English has ballooned so mammoth. Like, it has such a high quantity, like high, too much quantity, that sometimes if you're specializing enough in communication, you would naturally rarely even use the common pool of words. You would use all your specialized words in separate situations. And that's what would cause a like a bimodal use case, where in one situation you're gonna be reminded of very specific vocabulary, and in another case it's not. And I'm not sure if Japanese, that translates to Japanese. For example, when I'm in an office, like in a lab meeting, right? I'm in a lab meeting. My vocabulary just shifts. It shifts to a whole new, it shifts completely to a new word bank. The thing is, if I don't keep this up, that word bank goes away, right? It just disappears. So the funny thing here is, I guess you could get worse at language, I suppose. Which kind of is a very depressing thought, right? So you don't get to keep what you don't practice. And that's kind of my thought on proficiency tests. Like, I suppose if you're really, really concerned, or you want to upkeep, taking a new language proficiency test every now and again would be kind of interesting. And for me, I don't know how long it's been taking a proper English proficiency test. I think it's been 20 years since the last time I had a formal evaluation of my English. Dude, this another thing about English, holy heck, you need like my strokes, like my hand strokes are so much faster than this little app can respond to. Like these lines, this is not the motion I'm making, and I can only imagine how terrible it is to like try to do like kana and stuff when this actually affects the way it's just not fast enough. But anyways, that's a side story. This is knee. I just wanted to draw a knee. I don't know why I like the knee. 20 years. Oh no. But apparently I can confirm one thing, is that when you think about proficiency, like native like, right? If you're a native like or a native speaker, ultimately for me, here's my personal opinion, because I didn't really offer an opinion at this point. My personal opinion is reaching this state is a lot lower in English from the perspective of a specialist. And I imagine it's probably going to be similar to Japanese. However, I like to think that, say like you finish N1 and you finish C2, let's just say these are somehow in a crazy world they're equivalent, right? The only thing they're equivalent by is the arbitrary classification of native like or native. Those are that's the only thing I can concretely say, at least semantically, they are equivalent, which is when you pass C2, if you pass N1, you're native like. So this is where you get your black belt, right? Your black belt in martial arts. Now the sky's the limit, right? The sky's the limit. And I earnestly think, just from cursorily looking at the methodology between it, English has a higher threshold than Japanese, the range. Now, what are the trade-offs? I kind of like this. It means like there's precision. There's no excess, right? You're not excessively pushing the ceiling, like raising the ceiling, artificially raising the ceiling, even like maybe excessively unnecessarily raising the ceiling on English. But this is tied to how many people use the language, right? Because the language morphs with its pool of inspiration, and inherently that led me down a rabbit hole to looking at the current usage, right? And Japanese doesn't even rank in the top 10 at the moment, even though it might seem like that because we talk about environments, pre-selection. Japanese is not in the top 10, and it's not eclectic. It's not as eclectic as one might think. So a lot of times usage can be selection bias, right? Like Mandarin. Mandarin can be a selection bias where like the magnitude of a specific group is gigantic. Absolutely. So this is where it also continues to favor English. Not because it's better or worse, it just happens to be the one language that has a lot of inspired tools. So universally, even Japanese people say like, I've met a Japanese scientist before, right? I had the privilege to meet a native Japanese scientist before. And even then, the words that they have to use are either created for English speakers or they adopt those words. So even in a very high level specialized area, English is still the bridge to making new words, to bridge the languages. So in a way, English, while it forms the basis of those words, it becomes adopted into the other languages. So the more people that uses English, they will get more adopted English words, and that becomes also part of their proficiency. Like, I'm curious if kanji has gotten to the point where they start incorporating like how frequent it is, incorporating the way katakana is incorporating, like compressing katakana to kanji, but it's of English origin, right? What is that frequency like? So is English contributing to kanji, or is it the other way around? And I would say, for the most part, because of its universal use, English is contributing to other languages more than it is contributing to itself because there are more users. That's not it doesn't sound like it's fair and it's like one-sided flow. It's just because English is in a position that Japanese isn't, for example, right? So here I'm just so curious. I love to ask someone who is proficient, or like not proficient, but I suppose native like in both, right? But also somehow is a superhero. So they're native in both and is a superhero because they would need to also specialize in a field that is in English and Japanese. That's insane. Like, just thinking about trying to find someone who has command of more than 2 languages, right? More than 2 languages, and is also in a specialized field. And what I mean by specialized field, that field is not language. So I was trying to find examples of that online, where someone is incredibly specialized in those 2 languages while also being in a specialized field. I can tell you now, I did not find this in science, because humans are humans. They're not superheroes, in my opinion. So if you go to like an international conference, you will notice that there is a gap between multilinguistics and how far they are like concentrated in their discipline, because the discipline, this already requires a lifetime, right? This already requires a lifetime with one language. I'm asking for something almost super heroic, where you're already having you're already striving to be a specialist in a field that's not attached to the usage of multiple languages. Now you're gonna go out of your way to become a specialist in 2 languages while also juggling this. Is there a person out there that exists that does that? Probably, maybe one out of 10 million people are able to do that or something. I certainly don't have the privilege to meet such a person, but it would be vastly interesting. It would be incredibly unnecessarily revealing to me, as in enlightening to me, to hear the perspective from such a person. In science, when I'm ever in like an international conference, it's pretty clear that there's who the English speakers are and who are specialists in a different language, or who has the primary languages. Because when you start talking about the specialized field stuff, it comes together. When you leave this specialized field, you notice who are primary English speakers and who are not, right? Or primary Japanese speakers, Hindi, maybe it's Punjabi, I have no idea. Arabic, Italian, German. You really know, it's very noticeable the moment you leave the field. But the field itself in English is like living in a different world. The moment you enter a room in a specialized field, and I can only speak for like biology at large, sort of, the more specific it gets, the more incomprehensible it is. And we're not talking about sounds anymore, like sounds, like kana. We're not talking about kana and stuff. Everyone has the kana, or the quote unquote the kana. Everyone has the ability to hear these words and know what they think about the words. But when you enter into a specialized room in English, it's like, I hear all the words, they don't make any sense. It's just absolutely bonkers. Like, as a specialized person, even when I went from like, I have a tendency on virology. I walk into a seminar, right? A seminar about other parasites. It's incomprehensible. I just, the words are there. I know all the words if I contextualize it myself, but in English, in my opinion, and I am so curious if this happens to Japanese people or not, when you walk into a room, because of how specialized you are in English, or a specific compartmentalized usage, it makes it all the more difficult to have any idea what's going on in another specialized group. And when it comes to at least science itself requires being multidisciplinary. As in, if you spend most of your time in biology, you might want to go to chemistry for a while. Because yes, they share the same pool of English, like a pretty big pool of English. But holy heck, does that not help you understand these two? It's like a meme at this point. If I had to layman this a little bit, right? It's like football, sorry, for those international folks. Soccer and football, right? Soccer, football, and an American football person, right? American football, go into the same room and they start talking in English. Now, this is not a greatest example, but when they talk, there's going to be misunderstanding. Even though they use the same words and expressions, there's gonna be misunderstanding. Everyone knows the pool of English, but there's gonna be misunderstanding, inherently misunderstanding. Now this these things might not be as technical because they have like bigger overlap. There's like bigger English overlap, like 90%. When you go from then you start getting higher into the educational system. Biology and chemistry is still super general, but I think there's even less overlap. It's like 60%, because you spend more time if you go into chemistry using words in a different context and pool of words than biology. So you get to the point where you're a virologist and you walk into a structural I don't know, protein seminar or something, and I would get like 10% comprehension, and most of that deals with the words being used differently. It's not as big as there are new words I don't understand, as in like words I don't know, for example, like not literal new words. So the rarity and frequency of the new words are still very manageable. There might be one or two terminologies here and there, right? But the same terminology has an entirely different context. And in Japanese, oftentimes, like I've only spent 9 days learning Japanese, and a lot of times I wrote, and yesterday we celebrated this, where like, oh yeah, you just infer, it's context dependent. However, that's how I felt about English. Like, it's great when it works, but at the highest level in English, it's a detriment. So like most of the misunderstandings come from context-based communication. So this is where I would say, yeah, I agree with the person that brought this up yesterday. Science does require a lot of precision, but the precision is not necessarily in the words themselves, but using the words to explain the lack of precision. And what I mean by this is, say you have a kanji, right? You have a kanji. How I would illustrate it, at least from my rudimentary understanding of kanji, you have this, like, I don't know, this character, whatever it may look like. I don't know if this is a character or not. Say it like this, right? There's a meaning associated with this. And then there's also contextual assumptions, right? Contextual assumptions. Now, I have no idea if someone that works in science, that this contextual assumption and meaning is special. And what I mean by special is how you use it. Very few people will ever understand how the heck what that means. So literally it violates the culture of Japanese language, where when you use something contextually, everyone's on the same page because rules make it so that you're always contextually on the same page. In English, scientific writing has to be precise because words suck at being precise. So, like, for example, we go back to inoculate. The word inoculate, as a scientific writer, as someone who's writing scientifically, they have to explain what that means. You have to explain in great detail, literally on paper, what you mean by inoculate. If you just say inoculate, you're PEP. like you've just done goofed if you do not explain what this word means. In Japanese, it's always inferred, right? A lot of times their words are contextual based. So here's where oftentimes when someone says, hey, you kind of strike me as a teacher, or maybe even a therapist, or someone that just is educated, right? And I've always tried to narrow down, what does that even mean? Like, what makes it sound, why do I sound educated, even though I'm using words that every day someone can comprehend, right? Is the idea that I'm always conditioned to try to explain the lack of English precision. So oftentimes someone would say, what does a conversation between me and someone else would look like? Say, hi, how are you? How are you? Right? In English, this is something that I would present to a Japanese person who's learning English for the first time, right? Or something like that. Hi. That's a response. How are you? This is a greeting, right? And this is a greeting. Most people would say, oh yeah, that's a pretty good greeting. And I'm like, to me, as a specialist, these are pleasantries. And I have seen some Japanese, like English, multilingual, like super specialized multilingual people say the same for some Japanese phrases. And this is where I got the inspiration from. Someone said like one of the Japanese phrases just absolutely is useless. It just doesn't mean anything. It's just filler. So as an English specialist, these things don't mean anything. They don't mean anything yet. And the emphasis is yet. Yet. They have zero value yet. You have to add something to them. Or something has to be inferred. Is this a friend that is saying hi? And if it's a friend, this hi means something else. Right? If this is a stranger, like if a stranger says hi, it means something else. So it's a pleasantry, probably more likely when you're saying hi to a stranger. It's not a pleasantry when it's someone you know. It's endearment. So it's a and trying to explain that is imprecise. It's imprecise. In Japanese, you could say hi politely, or hi super politely, or just hi formal or casually, right? In English, you need extra words. That's kind of what I'm saying. In science, most of the time when you sit in a room listening to someone else in a different discipline, all your common words, they don't mean it, like they have no meaning anymore. Like it's just so hard to understand. Like what do you mean infection? You know, what do you mean they died? Like how? Like what does die mean? Like dropout. Like, you know, say it's a trial or something, and dropout's like, what does that mean? Like, how did they drop out? What does dropout mean? So all this highlights what I mean by what we had a conversation yesterday about, is that English has this knack for being flexible, super flexible. That's why even for Japanese people, I would say the reverse, I would gamble that Japanese people will still find that it's easier than how English people think Japanese is hard, right? Like, because it's not the same. English is incredibly flexible. And because it's incredibly flexible, it's easy to native, but absurdly hard to master. Like, I feel so incompetent all the time. When you get into a room of equally proficient English speakers, it feels like you're an idiot. You're always constantly asking questions because English effectively takes on a new component. Who are you talking to? And that sucks. Like, what I mean is, it's not just, oh, is this person older than me? Or is this person younger than me? And then you assume the rest of the rules. Is, what did this person do? Because if you don't understand what this person does and they're not explaining it to you, you have no idea how to interpret the English anymore. So when English is at the highest level, not even at the highest level, let's just say there's an Indian American, right? This is a personal story. Indian American, and I'm Chinese American. We both, this is kind of like a bar joke. Let's say we both walk into a restaurant, right? We both walk into a restaurant and we want to talk about food. We talked about food over some good food, right? All the, like, I would say 60% of the casual English that we use, like generalized vocabulary that you can use, is lost in translation. Yeah. Now my question is, do Japanese people feel the same? Like, is there such a great loss in translation between Japanese people? I don't know. The language seems like it's restrictive enough with great rules and consistency, precision, right? With enough precision, I feel the sentiments don't usually get confused, in my opinion. A lot of times it just feels like this most of the time. The higher your education goes, you feel less and less competent, in my opinion. But this could just be me and the whole, like, self-selection, the Dunning-Kruger effect, imposter syndrome. Put me in a box or something. Someone help me with this box, I suppose. But I earnestly believe the bigger your vocabulary gets in English, I feel like your English proficiency actually goes down after a while. Like, it kind of peaks and then it dips a little. It's kind of like the Kruger-Dunning effect happening. And I'm not sure if Japanese people, when they talk about proficiency, like their chart, it'd be like just up, but kind of like just plateaus. It just keeps going that way. English feels more like, oh, it goes up really, really fast, like even faster. It goes here, and it kind of just slowly dips down. You know, like it just slowly dips down. It doesn't come to a max. It kind of settles and plateaus a little bit. Because there's a trade-off. As you get more and more into English, it just gets harder and harder to understand people. So what I mean is, the reason why I say this is, in life, as a specialist who speaks English, it's so exhausting. In a good way. Just, it requires so much energy. even at the exchange of words. Like, it's so overtly complicated that I almost feel like communication, there's a breakdown in communication a lot of times. And this is what's the funny thing about proficiency, right? About proficiency. If you're talking about proficiency, how well people communicate with the language, what the heck happens here? When you become so specialized that there's a breakdown in communication, it just gets worse. Like, because of how much you measure certain things that are measured in proficiency, those things become detrimental. Like, and as a personal feeling, like emotional as a human being, I actually love speaking, talking. And here's my hot take. I love speaking and talking and reading in a restrictive box. 10K. Maybe 10K. 10K vocab. And that's probably why I don't want to strive to master Japanese. But it might not be true. I might end up trying to master Japanese because at the top, Japanese people might not feel this way. But since I'm an English speaker, this is why when I come online, I don't use traditional vocabulary and speaking patterns that I would typically use like in a university setting, and I wouldn't use the same type of vocabulary when talking to my sister or my friends. It's just so exhausting when it comes to English because it's so imprecise. In fact, when you talk to friends, just all all the native English speakers out there who focuses a lot on English as a language, like mastering communication, when you sit at the table, ask yourself and make note of how often, if you're in the company of other people who are well spoken, how often do you just discuss what you mean in English? Not what you're talking about, just what you mean. Because I feel there's such a disproportionate amount of time discussing what the words you even use meant, what the words even mean. And I really earnestly don't feel like Japanese people do that. They get to talking about things using their language far more frequently and consistently than English people. And that's not a bad or a good thing, because that's why I spend hours talking about misunderstandings and English words, because that's the charm of English. One of the things that one has to tell a foreigner, right? If you're a Japanese person learning English, the first thing you have to come to learn is that English is incredibly flexible. So your goal is to get your meaning across enough for the person to resonate with you. That's it. There's yes, there are lots of rules and certain things and memory, but in the end, your proficiency, the depiction of being well spoken and language proficiency is largely attached to your ability to express the idea and get the expected response back, not how well you know the rules. And oftentimes I hear this in people who learn Japanese and then they compare it to English, and the first comment they make is, oh yeah, Japanese, this is what you do, this is how you do it, it's so neat, it's so well laid out, right? And then they would make this nonchalant comment like, yeah, education in English, it's just pretty meh. It's a mess. And I thought to myself, man, for someone who loves language, I'm sure you gotta know that English education is a mess because English has a culture that doesn't emphasize trying to restrict English. Like, what I mean is, the whole idea that when you think about English teachers, what do they do? What do they teach? They teach their English. Of course it's a mess. And then the reason why is the context is a lot of times when people who learn a lot of languages, they're really good, intuitive, they pick up like 20 languages, 30 languages. But then I started thinking, well, they're not responsible in having the skills to standardize what they learn and stuff to the masses. So they're making commentary on standardized education. And the first thing they think about is pretty obvious. English education, like what I mean is English itself. So education on this language is like the Wild West. If someone asks me, how do I sound like an intellectual? How do I acquire the ability to go into a conversation and be universally proficient at English? The answer is, I have no idea. I've been using this language for over 30 years, and I would say humbly, I am well above average in my motivations to constantly improve communication. And I can still tell you to this day, I'm learning how to use English because it just never stays static. It's constantly not measurable. So when people keep saying like, oh yeah, look at English education, like, oh my gosh, this guy doesn't even know the flags of, like, I don't know, the flag of Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan or something, or Russia and stuff. Like, just think about this for a moment. In the United States, we are all Americans are already using a language that's already hard to understand each other. It's incredibly baffling to expect that I feel like it's like a low-hanging fruit argument, like a low-hanging fruit where, oh yeah, their education's a mess because, right? Their education is a mess because they don't like learning, like they don't try to learn and they don't try to standardize like physics and chemistry and stuff. It's like, have you seen the language? English is, I think it's so fun. I mean, like, this is my element. Hey Indy, welcome back. Good evening. Konbawa. Konbawa. I keep saying G. Konbawa. Because I know now it's a K. Or it's a stronger. So Konbawa. Let's see. One thing I have to say about English is the language. Yes, Konbawa. What you call it? Oh, you know what? Konnichiwa uses the ha for the wa, huh? You know what I mean? Doesn't it? Or does it not? Does it? I don't even know. I haven't gotten there yet, so it's fine. Like when a ha and a wa is in a where. But anyways, I want to say it's not blaming anyone or what's worse or what's bad, but man, when oh, that's shortened. Oh, okay. And I can't wait to figure out if I know when an expression is shortened or not. One thing I have to say is I want to learn Japanese. Here's my going back to what started this digression. I want to learn enough Japanese where I walk into a, those like over evening setup restaurant stall areas, like the closing areas. I want to go in and I want to sit there and I want to listen to Japanese people talk to each other. I could do this in the future, obviously. I'm going to listen to Japanese conversations and I just want to people watch and see how frequently, if they ever discuss a loss in translation between Japanese people. I honestly think the charm of English and also the detriment of English, like if you're a pragmatic person and you're like scrap for time and you're constantly like, if you're a Japanese person, you're gonna feel anxious, in my opinion. So say you take a Japanese person and and I'm trying to teach this Japanese person English, and then we go into, I don't know, an American restaurant and we sit there and we listen to conversations by other people. I have a feeling, in my opinion, one of the emotional responses Japanese people will have is, man, people who speak English are really typically, like, from a foreigner perspective, people will say like, man, they really take their time to get to the point. It's like, why do they spend so much time not talking about the point that they're trying to make, instead of talking about how they don't understand each other, even though they speak the same language, right? And then I started thinking like, man, one emotional response I would like to believe it's going to happen that immediately becomes a culture shock for someone who speaks Japanese and wants to speak English is the idea that when you use English, you have to be laid back. Like, you have to chill the heck out, because it takes a really long time to get to a point, especially if you start learning more and more English. Then it gets longer and longer, as in like it takes longer and longer to clear out all the details. Meanwhile, Japanese people, I'm so curious when I learn enough Japanese, if I go into a restaurant and I just see them, like, they get things done. Like, oh, now they're talking about the weather, they're talking about the politics, they're talking about their lives, and like strangers just knock it out of the park, right? You meet a new stranger and you practically shared your life story in like 5 hours. Meanwhile, when you go and meet a stranger in English, there's a huge gap between a well-spoken person and someone who has a loss in translation, but at the same time, there's this middle intersection where this person can't be super like intelligent in English because they will sacrifice their well-spokenness. So what happens here is when you meet a stranger in English, like say you're approaching a stranger in English and you're an English speaker, the first thing is like, oh, hey, how are you? And then you would start to explain everything you mean in English. Like, oh, I'm a scientist. No, wait, by scientist, I mean I'm a biologist. And by biologist, I mean a virologist. And so that doesn't mean that I know a little bit about other fields of biology, but I really am a virologist. And you start thinking, as a Japanese person, like I'm trying to imagine myself in the shoe of a Japanese person. I'm like, dude, I still don't follow you, but man, you just spent the first 15 minutes explaining the English word. And that's kind of the fun part about English, like how the mannerisms that an English person goes through to explain the words they use is very revealing to the type of person they are. If you meet someone like me, I suppose, someone who's like in education, explicitness is a characteristic of the type of person that's required to be in a specialized field, especially science. So when yesterday, when Turnus said that I must have a high vocabulary base because of my educational background and maybe the nature of how I speak, is often because you need that vocabulary to be able to explain the English you are already using. And that's the inherent weirdness that I just don't see myself ever seeing in Japanese. When you learn kanji, it only makes things clearer. When you learn English, it actually makes things more confusing. The more English you learn, the more likely you're going to have to explain even more. English becomes, ironically, more and more imprecise when it comes to talking with another person, but it becomes more precise for you. As in, the person who learns more vocabulary will be able to greater express those things. When you're talking to someone, like if you need to express those things, you have a lot of tools, but you also, it becomes more and more complicated in how to explain those things. For example, I spent a lot of my years in science. Every word no longer has the same fixed number of meanings to the person. So when someone says, I'll just give you a great example because it comes up all the time. I tell people a lot of times, briefly discussing how virology is intersected with oncology. And oftentimes, instead of using the word virology or oncology, I use the word virus. Viruses, and I use the word cancer. All right? So when you have a conversation, someone say, oh, I know cancer. I know cancer. So they ask me about cancer. They ask me about cancer, right? Like, and what do? Well, one common route is they talk about eating. Okay, all right. So eating leads to cellular respiration. And then they're like, oh yeah, it contributes to cancer, right? Or eating certain things as a side note, certain things lead to cancer or contribute. Well, they say lead to cancer. And here it is. It's already gone off the rails. First of all, I said I'm interested, like I have a stent in oncology. And then I use the word cancer to simplify it, but I really actually don't mean pathology. I don't really understand pathology of cancer, as in this heckin' word means like 8 billion other things in English, and you need to explain that. But instead, you know how in Japanese a lot of times the language is contextual. It's always implied. This is implied. The moment you start implying in English is the moment you fall off the rails. Especially unless you are all restricted to the same amount of vocabulary and that usage stays the same. And you might be thinking, well, English has that. I just illustrated with the phrase hi. Hi is not even contextually based. It's individually based. It's not a contextual rule that everyone knows. It's individually based. When you say hi to someone, they're gonna respond with the full response. Or when you say hi to another person, they're not gonna even say hi back. Like, it's, and you have to recognize all of these things to master English, right? Like, one of the things is you have to recognize what kind of English speaker you're talking to, because I can tell you now, it can lead to bad results if your desire is to be agreeable and well-spoken all the time, or as much as you can. Mastery of the English language is not something you want to base your happiness on. So oftentimes I'm thinking to myself, is Japanese going to be the same? Like, as I'm trying to learn more and more in Japanese, is that going to happen? Like, so there's a side of me that is emotionally daunted by the idea that maybe I could try to master Japanese. But my common reaction oftentimes from a person who has spent most of their life speaking English and specializing in a very highly educated competitive field is that mastery is kind of overrated for the emotional health. So oftentimes for me, I want to be proficient at something, and that's sufficient enough for me. And even when I said when something is proficient and sufficient, I can already hear the gears churning. Because if I said these things to different people, it just does not mean the same thing anymore. Like, if I go up to someone and ask them, how do you distinguish between what is proficient and what is sufficient? Or what is precise and what is accurate? Right? And then you throw in a left hook, consistent. That's what yesterday's discussion about my English proficiency, like how do I evaluate my English proficiency? So this is where all the digression started. Yesterday I had a conversation with someone, right? And I had no idea what my English proficiency is, and I rated myself. That's how out of touch. Oh, and just to give you an idea why this is off the rails already. So first of all, they know cancer. My first inclination is probably different from me. So this is a loss in translation. So they know cancer. I don't know what they mean by they know cancer. That has no help. Like, English does not help you with say I know cancer. That's like, what is it? So they ask about cancer. So now you have to figure out, you have to be on the same page. What do they mean by cancer? Cancer is a loss in translation already. And then they talk about eating. What do they mean by eating? Right? And then they talk about certain things contribute to cancer. And I'm like, oh, they're not talking about cellular respiration. That is a natural process in your body that may create and contribute to free radicals that may cause mutational genetic, like none of that. They're just literally talking about things that are carcinogenic. So what happens is, if you're thinking about things that are carcinogenic, at some point it's going to come back to like radicals. So this whole line of conversation, you would stop right here. You won't get any further than here, because it will take 10 to 12 hours to explain what those words don't mean the same thing anymore. Like, it's always constantly discussing about what the word means. Like eating, what do you mean by eating? Eating is not helpful. And I'm sure Japanese have these discussions, but I'm just genuinely really curious if they're just like, oh, nice, and they just move on. I think one of the quirks about English is there's so many people using the language, so naturally all the English has loss in translation. Even amongst specialized English speakers, I feel like it's even worse the more English you know. And if you're measuring English proficiency, the irony here is, don't get, in my opinion, if someone is learning English, don't get discouraged, because if you feel like you have no idea what you're talking about anymore, the things that you have no idea what to talk about anymore, you're going in the right direction. That's the ironic thing here. Like, if English has become overtly complicated and you feel less and less competent, I think that you're on the right track to being a proficient English speaker. It's that constant preponderance and incompetence that makes English, in my opinion, a constant drive for people who like the English language, not the constant increase in competence. So I guess because of this, I approach Japanese differently as well. I have no problems sounding incompetent in Japanese, but I think there's going to be a cultural problem here. As in, my Japanese will likely come out more sloppy. It's going to be a little bit messy. It's going to stay loose. because I'm an English speaker, right? And because of that, I will genuinely have proficient Japanese, but I will always sound like a foreigner. Maybe it might be different. Who knows? Who knows? It's just that I prefer the culturalism in English than I do Japanese, even though I love the Japanese culture and the Japanese language. It's very precise, it's very elegant, right? I've heard that that most personal things aren't discussed with strangers when you're in Japan. Yeah, that could alleviate a lot of things. You know what I mean? And just so we're clear, since we're English speakers, so when you say personal, I am to clarify what I mean by personal is that things that are individually based are probably less. And what I mean by this is outside of the drinking hours, outside of the evenings, right? Outside of evenings, you're not outside the evenings where you practice. What is that phrase? One, like practicing being honest, right? Like drinking and stuff. In most cases, it's what was that phrase? It's matae. It's that is the culture, right? Matae or something. You don't say things that is individually based. So you don't share your opinions. There's decorum to manage. So it minimizes individually based conversations in public. So in public, right? It minimizes that individually based things. In English, when you're talking to even a stranger, their English is personalized. And what I mean by that is it's not like I'm not using personal as in my life personal stuff. It's not just life personal stuff. So for example, I'm not going to, if I was acting more like this is probably not the right term, but it's something like that. It's something like matae, but in English, when someone's talking to me about cancer, I'm not going to share I'm gonna try to share my personalized perspective in English, and that's where the loss in translation happens in English. So for example, oh yeah, you know, a stranger comes in and it's like, oh, dude, Japanese is easy. That's personalized English. In Japan, in Japanese, I could see like, oh, it seems like you are enjoying it. Like they observe and they don't impart their individualized thoughts yet. Even when you're talking about like things, like all the like the objective things, it's like, wow, that's a big number. That's a small number. So in English, speakers already have a habit of all their words are personalized already, and you're constantly like digging for where are you going with this. Like whenever I think about explaining something, it takes a really long time to make sure that I am speaking sufficiently enough to make it intelligible. English can legitimately be both so easy to understand and so easy to misunderstand all at the same time. Like you can so confidently misunderstand something. You know what I mean? And I want to know if Japanese people do that with their language. I want to see if that happens, where you can confidently be way off the mark. Think about it this way, like when someone says, guys, listen, I have a secret to tell you. Secret to tell you. It's very important. Right? Very important. is life-changing. Okay? It's life-changing. All right? I don't think my English is that great. There you go. Misunderstanding. What? That's your big secret? That's your very important? Or the next comment is like, I think I disagree. Nah, your English is pretty good. That's English. Anything that comes out of a person's mouth is so individualized. It's always a constant struggle to know where they're going. And I'm specifically talking about when higher English proficiency happens. And this is what I mean by I love talking to younger people. I love talking to younger minds. And even older, rustic, what we would call, right, straightforward people. And my question is, if I go to Japan, will I also feel this? This is kind of why I like the countryside and need a break from, like, quote unquote intellectual environments. Because boy howdy, is this rewarding yet exhausting. It's just incredibly exhausting. And I'm sure at the highest of levels of Japanese, there's a lot of this. But the question is, what is the proportion? What is the proportion of straightforward versus intellectual? Is it, I would like to say it's greater than English. This is almost a breath of fresh air, in my opinion. When people use English and it's just straightforward. Not even, this is independent. Straightforward is independent of English proficiency, in my opinion. So if you're asking yourself, what does English proficiency mean? Well, better communication, more precise communication. Well, I mean, there's a counter, there's a duality here. The more English you learn, the less and less proficient technically it eats away at being straightforward. You change your food to your favorite, I mean, you change your profile pic to your favorite food, huh? Let me see. Oh, is that like a, I don't know what that is. Is that like a a pudding? Oh, it's a spread. Oh, it's a meat paste. I see. Fair enough. Fair enough. Military food, but in stores? Oh, I see. So let's take it all the way back now. So let's wrap up this so then I can put in maybe 2 hours of hiragana and maybe a little get our feet wet with katakana. So in the end of the day, my question from yesterday was where my digression came from. How do you measure English proficiency, right? Because a lot of times people want to know how proficient they are in a language. And obviously I did the same with Japanese. JLPT, right? JLPT, right? And you do not measure it based, in my opinion, I don't think it's based on objective metrics. Maybe. It's difficult to measure proficiency in English if you're talking about the use of English, in my opinion. because when you increase the properties that most people value, like, I don't know, the extent of your writing, like what are you measuring by the extent of your writing or speaking, reading, and stuff, right? All this stuff, there's eventually not only a diminished return, in my opinion, diminished return, there's also a point of excess. Much like the culture in, I guess, the United States, there is too much. And when you reach this point, that, in my opinion, is proficient enough. I don't know if this is, since I haven't ever reached that point in Spanish. And then, you know, I have a long way to go in Japanese. I don't really think, like, we're talking about emotionally, obviously. I'm trying to think of the emotional embodiment of the word proficient. When you get to a certain point, writing, speaking, and reading, it contributes to a decrease in proficiency, in my opinion. And that happens. That happens a lot. So not only do you reduce in proficiency, you become less precise. You become less precise. You become less efficient. And if you don't desire these things, certainly that's a bad thing, right? For me personally, I like this thing. I like these things. I like that English is become less efficient and less efficient, less precise, because that's why speaking English is a lot of fun. Technically, those two things are very different, so they could scale how good you are. Writing usually doesn't have slang, and speaking almost always be full of slang. What, you mean speaking speed and reading and... Oh no, see, we already have a problem here. If you're talking about me saying writing, speaking, reading, and stuff, or unless you're talking to Milo, that's the exact point I'm making. Like, every facet, this isn't comprehensive, so again, Japanese problems. Japanese problems, you're inferring that this is comprehensive, but I'm not being comprehensive. It's not comprehensive. If I was being comprehensive, it would be like, etc., I suppose. So I've already failed to stop you from inferring contextually. Because English, if you infer contextually, you're going to miss the mark. I'm so curious what I'm gonna think about Japanese later when we keep thinking about inferring context. Write these 4 words in 4 squares and draw what you think about them. Reading, speaking, I don't have any thoughts about those. They are like, you are not being specific enough. When you write writing, speaking, reading, and hearing, you're going down the senses, which is tactile, speaking would be vocal right here, reading is eyes, and hearing is ears. Now there's also confounding here, right? Confounding. And reading and writing is confounded. And then when you wanted me to separate them, all these are confounded too. So when you're telling me to separate these, the answer is no. You can never separate these. That's a compartmentalization problem. So you basically did what Indy said. You cannot separate them. So all of these are related. Now, that's why it didn't matter what I wrote, in my opinion. Like, if I put a box over these things, it wouldn't suggest that they're separated from each other. So all of these are, you can try really hard. You can try really hard, right? For yourself. So if you're only learning by writing, good for you. Good for you if you're only learning by writing. But when I write, I hear it in my head. I also try to speak it. And I'm reading what I'm writing. Right? Right? So, and then if I'm speaking, I see it visually in my head. I hear what I'm speaking, and I'm reading it in my head. When I'm reading, I'm speaking it to myself. I'm also writing it in my head. And I'm hearing it in my head. So that's what I call integrated learning. This is active learning. You can technically, a thing that separates these, you could passively learn much better. You can passively learn more easily, I suppose, by habit with these. So you could like passively write. What's a way of passively writing? See something? Unfortunately, it's technically passively reading and writing. You can see something, imitate. And then that's it. Like, it ends there. Or you can hear something, and not understand. Kind of. So, there are ways to kind of separate these properties, but I wouldn't ever separate these properties. Learning requires all these properties to be tackled as much as possible, and we're gonna go into that today because that's how I learned hiragana and katakana. So I don't have a great answer for you about how to compartmentalize these. These are not separate things. Also, what are they? What should I call them? Parts, pieces, categories. They're categories. I mean, I call them actions. Actions you can do. So good grouping, in my opinion. This is where English comes in, right? We're literally now talking about English. Like the English words that I use. I would call them actions, right? Things you can do to learn a language. So actions you can do to learn a language, right? That's as precise as I could get. So you can read. If you associate this, you can read, write, hear, or aka listen. What are we missing? Speak. And then there are more actions that are confounded here. Understanding. Remember is another component. Recall is another action. There's a difference between remembering it at the time and then bringing it back up later. For language learning, right? We're talking about proficiency. I know you wrote reading, writing, hearing, and speaking regarding language proficiency. So there is still others like understanding, remembering something. So encoding, and then recalling are two to actions as well. You can encode something and forget something. So when you forget something, you can no longer recall it. One person said vocabulary, that's these things. So these two properties, remembering, or these three properties, understanding, remembering, encoding, and recalling, is properties of vocabulary. So understanding the vocab, understanding the word, committing it to memory, and then being able to bring it back up later. That's understanding, encoding, and recalling. And usually that's bound by vocabulary. So you don't have to necessarily be able to engage these other properties that much doing vocabulary. So when someone says, oh, I remember the word, like, I remember this word, sanguine. And then and that's it. It just ends there, right? But what else can you remember about the word sanguine? Its definition. And if you're saying you can remember stuff, you're actually recalling it. But to recall, you have to encode this in the first place. So you actually have to like commit this to memory before you can even recall, and then you might get the definition, which involves understanding. Yeah. I would call it comprehension, but you can read and write things without comprehending it, right? What's a great way to read and read and write something without comprehending it? Write a kana, right? Like I could write this and not understand anything about this. So what I did here is I recall, I write, and I also saw. I have no understanding. And I have no sound, right? So when you add sound, this is su. Or yeah, this is su, right? And you might be thinking, okay, now I have sound. And then I said su. So now I have speech and hearing at the same time. So the goal is, when it comes to learning languages, you have to measure pretty much all of these things in some way, shape, or form. How do you measure all that stuff? That's why I just spent the last 2 hours trying to talk about, right? Because the answer that I can provide you is, I have no idea. I mean, I guess I have some idea. Okay. Some idea. I don't want to give people the incorrect impression. I have some ideas, but it was a rabbit hole. Holy heck, it was a rabbit hole. And what humbled me about how incompetent I was really incompetent when I said something yesterday. And I told the person I shared that I feel like I only had 10k English words. As in, I truly and earnestly believed that this was my competence level in English. Apparently, this is like middle school, or this is like middle school to high school level. So like sort of it's closer to the end of high school. Like I'm like thinking, oh, well now. So yesterday I spent like 3 and 4 hours finding out that no, it's in fact it's greater than 40k. So it's okay. It's where it is likely. It's collegiate level, which is fine, I guess. And then I went through the rabbit hole of saying, how do you measure English proficiency? How do you measure Japanese proficiency? And then led to wild evening of thoughts. And in the end of the day, the answer is I have some ideas, but it's not my field of expertise. And all it gives me is lots and lots of questions to ask someone one day. If I ever bump into a linguistic expert or something, I have lots of burning questions. And that's my favorite part about life in general. Like how I love learning new things. I have like papers and notebooks of burning questions for any time if I bump into an expert. I just have 10 or at least 10 burning questions for someone who spent their life doing this stuff, as opposed to me who choose largely not to focus on these things. So in the end, all this ranting is just opinions, thoughts, sharing my enthusiasm. Life is interesting when you have lots of questions to answer. In my opinion, if you have too many questions to answer, that might be overwhelming. But for me, sky's the limit. I love having lots of questions to answer. That's why science was so good for me intellectually, but so bad for me health-wise. I legitimately felt like I always had too many questions to answer, and it destroyed my health. It's like having an addiction to something. There's too much of it. There are too many questions to answer in science. Not enough time. It was completely overwhelming. I lost sleep. I stopped eating. Maybe I'll go back in like a more restrictive way, maybe a little more self-control. That would be great. A little more discipline. That's just how I'm gonna wrap up, right? So good news. I can sort of tell people that I'm pretty decent with English, and I can kind of explain why that is. Like, sort of. I can kind of sort of explain what makes it convincing that I'm decent at English. So it gives me a little confidence, just a wee bit confidence, to offer English oriented advice. At the same time, it really told me and explained to me what might be important to people learning English. So it may help me be a better person teaching English. Because these numbers do matter. It might sound like I'm saying they don't matter. They actually matter less to me. But I have to remember that I need to know these numbers in some way, shape, or form because other people are using those. It's kind of like not trying not to be a snob, right? Like, it's not trying to be that guy where, oh, I mastered this already. Don't pay attention to those things. It's not important to you. It's important to them. They wouldn't bring it up if it's not important to them. So that kind of thing. I want to keep that at bay. So yes, I can earnestly say at least I have a C2 plus English usage. Honestly, I really thought all these years of like streaming and talking to other people, I imagine I probably forgot a lot of those things. But apparently not really. So that's kind of a pleasant surprise. It was a pleasant surprise how much, quote unquote, the last property understanding I had. Like the understand component, the intellectual component in English. I thought my English has worsened over the years. And quote unquote worsened as in my proficiency went down based on those tests. So I was going to try to make a rationale for explanation as to why some people still think I'm well spoken when, according to a standardized test, my English is pretty mid. And honestly, 40K, one last fun little fact. English tests, some of the English tests, they only go up to 20K plus. They only go up to 20K plus. So what that means is the tests can't even rate me. Like we were talking about word understanding. So words in English. So it's only rated for 20 plus. As in, like, when you hit 20k plus, they don't have words that are accurately enough for so there's an upper limit to all the, like, the free tests, because they're old, right? They're old, they're outdated. So a lot of them cite their sources like 1995, maybe between 1995 and 2010. And that's what I mean. Standardized tests it takes a really long time. Yeah, over 9,000. Yeah, it's over 9,000. I can tell you that. It's over 9,000. So all the standardized tests that are free and stuff, there's a cap. And there's no way I confidently can say it's greater than 20k, because the lower limit, your tests is generally most as reliable as your weakest one, right? Your upper limit. So I would say 20k. English test is about, it's over 20k. Yeah, it's over 20k. That's all I can say. And when you do C2 tests, like a C2 test, the vocabulary bank is 16k. So C2 is what people would say you start your native-like journey. Your native-like journey in English starts at C2. So once you pass C2, you're living your life, starting your next chapter as a native-like speaker. As in, now you can take in English at your pace and specialize and do whatever you want with your English. So C2 is often rated around 16k. So there you go. What would I say when I was at high school? So here's the thing. The nice thing about high school and middle school, the nice thing about high school and middle school and stuff is there are metrics, right? For kids. As in, like, kids are, quote unquote, let's use that same colloquial, blank slates. And I'll give you a little story. It's a little bit longer here. So when I was growing up, my family are first-time immigrants, right? They're the first generation. I'm second generation. So elementary school, I was in a poor social economic place. So oftentimes English is underdeveloped, right? English is underdeveloped along with everything else, but let's just focus on English here. So sometime right before the end of elementary school, around 13 years of age, I moved to a new district, and life was good in terms of English, right? So English, I was probably, you would naturally think that English is behind. Like, I was probably behind in English. And then eventually we get to high school, which is where your question is regarding my high school. During this time, around high school and middle school, I was identified, and let me use this word loosely, I was, quote unquote, identified as a gifted person. And I'm going to throw in a joke here. You would think, since I'm Asian, I was identified as gifted in math or logic or something like that, right? Pattern recognition or something like that. But actually, I was identified for my vocabulary, for my for my English comprehension. And my English comprehension was already college level. So when I was going into high school, I already had a college level English. That's what identified me as gifted. I'm pretty sure, because when we got the scores back from like the evaluation and stuff, I scored nearly max marks when it comes to linguistics. And my math and logic and pattern, that's probably sucky. And you know what's funny about this? It stayed true. Like I went into science. I still sucked at math, logic, and pattern. That's still the suckiest part. Like I'm actually still accelerate at linguistics and stuff. Like what I mean is paying attention. I'm more hyper interested in less consistency. And what I mean is I'm emotionally motivated to find noise a lot more provocative than following rules like logic and pattern. So what did I do? I obviously as a kid chose a job that helped me with my weaknesses. I'm joking, by the way. I'm being facetious. Obviously, most younger people would choose something that they're good at. You know, like you would seek a career that you found you have aptitude for. But in fact, I actually love jobs. I picked a job that I legitimately played to my weaknesses. So I've always been super grateful. And here's why I picked my job, by the way. Here's a little interesting thing. And one day, maybe I'll have the time to like, I'm basically like, my heart is practically tearing up. Like I still haven't found a great way to thank my advisor for that. I chose science because of my advisor in college. More or less. And that's, he worked in sciences. So in the long run, the reason I picked my job was based on my emotional intelligence, not based on my intellectual intelligence. So I actually chose a job that, for all intents and purposes, was challenging. And I learned a lot. I grew a lot from it, right? And that's just my personality. I like challenges. I always pick the things that I am terrible at to get proficient in it. And to this day, I still feel like I was a meh scientist. Like just meh. I had some strengths, certain things that I may or may not have done better than others, but generally I'm pretty mid in the science department. And I never regret wondering what would happen if I decided to become like a writer. I actually wanted to be a film director. Someone already asked across these weeks. I wanted to be a film director or a video game director when I was younger. And I had a great interest in computer engineering and software design before it was a trend. Because we have to remember, what made those professions unattractive is that the entertainment industry is far less consistent than going into like science or health or medicine during my generation, right? So life has a funny way of changing, right? So by the time I finished with my science degree, you know, my PhD, the landscape is very different now. And I truly ended up believing that how do I combine my love for learning and in self-improving, right? Self-help and improving with basically a life of addiction, a life, and not that type of addiction, sorry, a life of emotional, intellectual addiction, basically always constantly striving for more without regulation and constantly taking up challenges and working to my disadvantage, as opposed to always taking things to my advantage, learning how to seize opportunities, see opportunity when they're available, learn to accept help, be collaborative and work with other people instead of a lone shark. All these things are all my weaknesses. So through this whole like life really weird struggle with life and whatnot, I've become hyper focused on the things that I lacked, and naturally speaking, because I inherently often hyper focus on things that I lack. in a healthy way now. Before, it was an unhealthy way. And I do feel oftentimes kids these days, when you're online and whatnot, it makes it even more palpable. It's so salient when you watch someone who's clearly better at you all the time on the things you love. That is constantly reinforcing. And there is a point in which you are too young, in my opinion, too young to be exposed to that so soon. I didn't need that. I didn't need the internet to do that. I grew up in an Asian household, and one of the cultural consistencies in Asian households is that you are always reminded that there's someone better. So one of the things that I tend to try to balance between that is I use that experience that I have, the Asian side, the Asianese side of things, and combine it and marry it with the nurturing and more flexible culture of Americans, like American culture. So I'm often providing both sides of the conversation when it comes to someone who's learning about not just languages, but about themselves, right? Young adults that one size did not fit all for them. So when school systems kind of like fail, they don't have the luxury to like just cater to very specific outliers. They typically cater to the standardized, the average. Why doesn't it occur in Japan? Japan is a country of conformity. In the United States, it's not a country of conformity. It's a country that requires in excess individualized things. That's not feasible. Like, it's not practical to be able to do that on a large scale. So little by little, my life had become catering to the smaller people, like to the underrepresented, right? And that's kind of fine. I'm okay with that. It's certainly not sustainable professionally. Like, you don't reach a large audience by resonating with the small audience, so to speak. But genuinely, there are things that can be extended to a larger audience. So when you have a good life, right? If your life is good, you're happy, you think you know what you want, it can still be better. So that can translate. It can translate to that. So someone whose life sucks, those are the people I'm attracted to, right? Like, I'm attracted to understanding and observing and trying my best to indirectly inspire them. They need to be indirectly inspired, as in, I'm not there to create dependency. I want to enable them to solve their own problems, right? That is the GOAT. That's a skill for life. It's a life skill. Meanwhile, it can one day be just like, well, my life is great, I'm really successful, and then someone comes along and is like, you know what, I'll do that. I'll make my life even better. Oftentimes, when your life is good as a human being, you become complacent. You don't necessarily strive for even better. So for me, when my life is good, I still inherently was addicted to making my life sucky. Because the Asian culture side of me and my upbringing, how does this relate to going back to high school and your question about my language, is that I always felt like I was on the back foot. Like elementary school, this is why I brought up elementary school. I always enjoy, my most comfort zone is being in the back foot. And that's why I always do it. So now that I'm really content with myself and I'm usually pretty stable, as in like I don't fluctuate very much, I'm usually content or slightly happy. I'm not like overly joyful or incredibly sad. I find other avenues. And what are other avenues? People with problems. People with problems. There's no shortage of that. What do people with problems have when you're trying to help them? Right? You're on your bad foot. You're on your back foot. You're already in the dumpster. When a person is in a bad place and they have a bad problem, by the time they often reach out for help, you're already fighting an uphill battle, right? And that's what I thrive on. I thrive on being on the back foot. Like it's an addiction that I try to be very disciplined about, because I can hurt people. I can unintentionally hurt people, like making empty promises, you know, empty promises. I want to really emphasize empty promises, because YouTube, content creators, empty promises. That is a very scary place. It comes from a place of passion and kindness. Without discipline, you inherently will make empty promises. So I don't want to say that I solve people's problem. I am attracted to people with problems, and I try to help. Not I succeed in helping them. I try to. There's no guarantee if I succeed or not. And oftentimes, when you're on your back foot, you take your small victories. You generally lose the war, unfortunately. So my experience is that I often win small battles. So this will be the hot take. I often win small battles so that one day, I hope the people that I help win those small battles, they will win the war. And the reason why I say I hope is I never know. 90% of the time, I'll never know. Because oftentimes, realistically, these people will outlive me. If they did win, they're on to better things. Because my interest was there was a problem to solve. So if someone doesn't have a problem anymore, I'm okay with that. I don't pay attention to people. Like it's not like a really, I'm trying not to sound cold, but I rarely pay more attention to people without problems. That doesn't mean I don't go on YouTube and watch people do incredible things. That's to solve something that I'm lacking. But generally speaking, if I was comparing to a person with problems, and then there was a person who's incredibly successful, right? And they're in the same room, my tendency would be more concerned with the person with problems. And then because I know this person's success is because they know what to do in this situation. So I overestimate a lot of times, which can be a problem. I have been bit before. I overestimate successful people, and I underestimate people with problems. And not in a sense of what they're capable of. I'm talking about how bad their problems can be. And I've gotten into trouble for this all the time. How bad. I prefer to care too much than too little in this case. And I prefer to care too little than too much in this case. And I would say it's about a 60-40 split. Sometimes on a good day, it's a 70-30. So I naturally will tick off 30% of successful people, and I would naturally like 30 to 40% of people, and I would naturally tick off 30 to 40% of people with problems. But I would take 70 to 60% being accurate. So if I worry a little too less about successful people, I usually get along between 70 and 60% of people. And then when people are problems, when I care too much, it usually works 70 to 60% of the time. Like the reason why I use percentages and proportions is because it's not all or none. It's never all or none. I strive to increase this percentage and decrease this percentage so that I can be universally agreeable. But in the end of the day, I prefer to take the safe route. If I see someone with a problem, I prefer to care too much than too little. Like with my background and my life experiences, this to me feels good. This caring too little is not the way to go. And obviously there are a lot of caveats. I'm being very general. People with problems have to be able to accept help first. And that does come with dangers. It might be too late. Right? It might be too late. But they have to be willing to accept help. And success people have to willing to accept advice too. Just we're more focused on people I'm attracted to, which are people with problems. Because I have a lot of problems. They're no longer problems now, but it's still really deep. All right, cool. There we go. And now I'm sure that's a little more than you probably wanted. But that's just it. You gotta explain.